The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I shuffled through the stack of applications on my desk. Another day, another pile of desperate people hoping to secure some fragment of security in an uncertain world. I'd been working at Everlast Life Insurance for over a decade, and the faces all blurred together after a while. Young families, middle-aged divorcees, elderly folks grasping at one last chance to leave something behind. I'd seen it all. Or so I thought. It was late on a Friday afternoon when his file crossed my desk. Most of my coworkers had already left for the weekend, their vacant cubicles forming a maze of shadows in the dimming office. I should have been out the door myself, but something made me pause as I reached for my coat. Maybe it was the worn edges of the manila folder, or the faded photograph paperclipped to the front. Whatever it was, I found myself sinking back into my chair, flipping open the file of one Mr. Ezekiel Thorne. The photo showed a withered old man, his skin like crumpled parchment stretched over sharp bones. But it was his eyes that gave me pause. Pale blue and piercing. They seemed to stare right through the camera and into my soul. I shivered involuntarily and turned to the application itself. Ezekiel Thorne. Age 92. No living relatives. Former occupation mortician. Current address, 13 Ravens Lane. As I scanned his medical history, my eyebrows crept steadily higher. This man should have been dead 10 times over. Heart attacks, cancer, strokes, he'd survived it all. And now here he was, at the ripe old age of 92, applying for a substantial life insurance policy. I'll admit, a small part of me was impressed. The old codger had beaten the odds time and time again, but the larger part, the part that had kept me employed at Everlast all these years, saw only dollar signs and risk. There was no way the company would approve this. The potential payout far outweighed any premiums we could reasonably charge. With a sigh, I reached for the large red denied stamp. It was just business. After all, nothing personal. As the stamp came down with a dull thud, a chill ran down my spine. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw those pale blue eyes staring at me from the shadows of my cubicle. I whipped around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the empty office and the ever-present hum of the fluorescent lights. Get it together, I told myself. You're working too late. Time to go home. I hurriedly shoved Mr. Thorne's file into the outgoing mail and grabbed my coat. As I rushed out of the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The weight of that gaze seemed to follow me all the way to my car. That night, I dreamed of pale blue eyes and the smell of formaldehyde. The next week passed in a blur of routine. I processed applications, attended meetings, and did my best to forget about Ezekiel Thorne. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the lingering unease that had taken root in the pit of my stomach. It was exactly 1 week later when I heard the news. I was in the break room, pouring my 3rd cup of coffee, when I overheard 2 co-workers gossiping by the vending machine. Did you hear about that old man who died last night? The one who lived in that creepy house on Ravens Lane? I frowncy, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Oh yeah. What was his name? Thorne. Ezekiel Thorne, I whispered, my voice barely audible. My coworkers turned to look at me, startled. Yeah, that's it. How did you know? I couldn't answer. The room was spinning, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. I mumbled some excuse and stumbled back to my cubicle, collapsing into my chair. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. Old people die all the time. It had nothing to do with me or the denied application. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing heart, I couldn't help but remember those piercing blue eyes. And I could have sworn I caught a whiff of formaldehyde drifting through the recycled office air. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Thorne's wrinkled face, his eyes accusing and full of malice. When I finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, my dreams were haunted by the sound of a pen scratching endlessly across paper, filling out an application that would never be approved. I awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with growing horror that the scratching sound hadn't stopped. It was coming from just outside my bedroom door. Trembling, I reached for the bedside lamp. As light flooded the room, the scratching abruptly ceased. I held my breath, straining to hear any movement in the hallway beyond. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, something slid under my door. A manila folder, its edges worn and familiar. With shaking hands, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, in spidery handwriting, were the words life insurance application. The rest of the page was blank, save for 2 words stamped in red at the bottom. Claim denied. I let out a strangled cry and threw the folder across the room. This couldn't be happening. It was just a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up. When I opened them again, the folder was gone. But the faint smell of formaldehyde lingered in the air, and I knew with sickening certainty that this was only the beginning. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the office, couldn't bear to look at another life insurance application. I spent the day huddled in my apartment, jumping at every creak and shadow. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself that it had all been in my imagination, almost. As darkness fell, I found myself drawn to my computer. With trembling fingers, I typed Ezekiel Thorne into the search bar. What I found chilled me to the bone. The first result was an obituary, dated just 2 days ago. But it wasn't the date that caught my attention. It was the photo. The man in the picture was undoubtedly Ezekiel Thorne. But he looked wrong. His skin was waxy, his posture too stiff, and his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had haunted my dreams, were open and staring directly at the camera. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart pounding. That couldn't be right. No funeral home would publish a photo like that. Would they? A soft thud from the hallway made me jump. I frowncy, listening intently. Another thud, closer this time. Then another. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps approaching my door. I held my breath, praying it was just a neighbor. The footsteps stopped right outside my apartment. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through my entire body. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Maybe if I stayed perfectly still, whoever or whatever was out there would go away. Another knock, louder this time, and then a voice, dry and raspy like dead leaves skittering across pavement. I know you're in there, Mr. Insurance Man. We have unfinished business. I bit back a scream. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. You denied my claim, the voice continued, seeping under the door like a noxious gas. But I'm not finished yet. Not by a long shot. The doorknob began to turn, metal scraping against metal. I watched in horror as it slowly rotated, defying the deadbolt that I knew was securely in place. Just as the door began to creak open, I snapped out of my paralysis. I ran to my bedroom, slamming and locking the door behind me. I could hear shuffling footsteps in the living room, getting closer. You can't hide from death forever, the voice called out, now just outside my bedroom. Sooner or later, everyone's policy comes due. I backed away from the door, looking wildly around for an escape route. The window caught my eye. I was only on the 3rd floor. I could make that jump if I had to. The bedroom doorknob began to turn. I didn't hesitate. I flung open the window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge. The cool night air hit me like a slap, clearing some of the panic from my mind. What was I doing? This was insane. I was 3 stories up, clinging to the side of a building, because I thought a dead man was trying to get into my apartment. I slowly turned back towards the window, ready to climb back inside and face whatever madness awaited me. But as I peered through the glass, my blood ran cold. Ezekiel Thorne stood in my bedroom, his pale blue eyes locked on mine. His skin was gray and mottled, his suit the same one he'd been buried in. As I watched in horror, he raised one withered hand and beckoned to me. I lost my balance, my foot slipping off the ledge. For one heart-stopping moment, I teetered on the edge of oblivion. Then I was falling, the ground rushing up to meet me. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. Multiple fractures. The doctors told me, but I was lucky to be alive. As I lay there, trying to piece together what had happened, a nurse came in with a small package. "This was left for you at the front desk," she said, placing it on my bedside table. With a sense of dread, I opened the package. Inside was a life insurance policy from Everlast. My own company had apparently taken out a policy on me without my knowledge. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a familiar red stamp, claim denied. I started to laugh, the sound bordering on hysterical. The nurse looked at me with concern, but I couldn't stop. Because there, in the corner of the room, I could see a pair of pale blue eyes watching me from the shadows. This was far from over. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital rooms and physical therapy. I told myself that what I'd experienced was just a vivid hallucination, brought on by stress and lack of sleep. The fall from my window, a moment of sleepwalking, nothing more. I almost believed it. But every night, as the hospital grew quiet and the shadows lengthened, I could feel those eyes on me. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a withered figure at the end of the hallway, or hear the shuffle of feet outside my door. The night staff whispered about the smell of formaldehyde that seemed to linger in my room, no matter how much they cleaned. I was released from the hospital on a gray, drizzly Tuesday. As the taxi pulled up to my apartment building, I felt a surge of panic. I couldn't go back there. Couldn't face those rooms where I'd seen him. "Keep driving," I told the cabbie, giving him the address of a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. That night, as I lay in the lumpy motel bed, I finally allowed myself to think about what had happened. If Ezekiel Thorne was really dead, and I'd seen his obituary, hadn't I? Then how could he be haunting me? And why? Because I'd denied his life insurance application? It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. A soft knock at the door made me jump. I held my breath, waiting. It came again, more insistent this time. "Mr. Insurance Man," that dry, raspy voice called out. "You can't run forever. Your policy is coming due." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not again. The doorknob began to turn. I scrambled out of bed, looking frantically for an escape route. The bathroom window was small, but I was desperate enough to try squeezing through it. As I rushed towards the bathroom, the motel room door creaked open behind me. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mixture of formaldehyde and decay. I slammed the bathroom door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the simple task. The shuffling footsteps grew closer. Now, Ezekiel's voice rasped, just outside the bathroom door. "Is that any way to treat a client? We have a policy to discuss." I turned on the faucet full blast, hoping to drown out his words. But somehow, his voice cut through the rush of water, clear as a bell. "You denied me in life, Mr. Insurance Man, but death is a much more accommodating underwriter." The doorknob rattled. I backed away, pressing myself against the small window. It was stuck, decades of paint sealing it shut. I clawed at it desperately, fingernails breaking as I tried to force it open. A bony hand burst through the door, splintering wood as if it were paper. I screamed, a sound of pure terror that I barely recognized as my own. The hand groped around, finding the lock and turning it with a decisive click. As the door swung open, I finally managed to break the window's seal. I didn't even bother to clear away the broken glass before I started to squeeze through the tiny opening. Shards sliced into my skin, but I barely felt the pain. All I could focus on was escape. I tumbled out onto the wet pavement of the motel's back alley, the rain soaking me instantly. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, finally collapsing in a park several miles away. As I sat there, gasping for breath and shivering in the cold rain, I tried to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't go on. I couldn't keep running forever. There had to be a way to end this, to appease the spirit of Ezekiel Thorne. With a sudden clarity, I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I dragged myself into the Everlast life insurance office. My colleagues stared as I limped past, clothes torn and stained, face gaunt with exhaustion and fear. I ignored them all, making my way straight to the records room. It took me hours of searching, but I finally found what I was looking for, Ezekiel Thorne's original application. With shaking hands, I pulled out a pen and changed the denied stamp to approved. I filled out all the necessary paperwork, backdating it to before his death. As I signed the final form, I felt a chill run down my spine. Slowly, I turned around. Ezekiel Thorne stood there, a grotesque smile stretching his decayed features. "Well done, Mr. Insurance Man," he wheezed. "But I'm afraid it's too late for that." I blinked, and suddenly I was back in my apartment, sitting at my desk. The insurance papers were gone. In their place was a single document, my own death certificate, dated today. "You see," Ezekiel's voice whispered in my ear, "your policy came due the moment you denied mine. Everything since then. Just a grace period." I felt a bony hand on my shoulder, and the world began to fade away. I woke up screaming, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. As reality slowly seeped back in, I realized I was in my own bed, in my own apartment. It had all been a nightmare, a vivid, terrifying nightmare, but a nightmare nonetheless. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by embarrassment. How could I have let a simple insurance application affect me so deeply? I glanced at the clock, 3:07 a.m. With a sigh, I got up to get a glass of water, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I padded to the kitchen, a floorboard creaked behind me. I frowncy, a chill running down my spine. Slowly, I turned around. The hallway was empty, shadows stretching in the dim light. I let out a shaky laugh. "Get a grip," I told myself. It was just a dream. I turned back towards the kitchen and found myself face to face with Ezekiel Thorne. His pale blue eyes bored into mine, his withered face inches from my own. The smell of formaldehyde was overwhelming. "Sweet dreams, Mr. Insurance Man," he rasped. And then, with a bony finger, he reached out and tapped me on the forehead. I jolted awake, gasping for air. My bedroom was dark and quiet, no sign of any undead visitors, just another nightmare. But as I reached up to wipe the sweat from my brow, my blood ran cold. There, in the center of my forehead, I felt a small, cold spot, exactly where Ezekiel's finger had touched me in my dream. I scrambled out of bed and rushed to the bathroom, flipping on the light. In the mirror, I saw a small, perfectly round bruise forming on my forehead. As I stared at it in horror, I could have sworn I saw pale blue eyes reflecting in the mirror behind me. I whirled around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the eyes were gone, but the bruise remained, a tangible reminder that the line between nightmare and reality was blurring. From that night on, sleep became my enemy. Every time I closed my eyes, Ezekiel was there, waiting. Sometimes he chased me through endless, twisting corridors. Other times, he simply stood and watched, those pale blue eyes never blinking. Always, I woke with new bruises, scratches, or other inexplicable marks. During the day, I was a wreck. I couldn't focus at work, jumping at every sound and seeing Ezekiel's face in every shadow. My colleagues whispered behind my back, their concerned looks following me as I stumbled through the office like a ghost myself. I knew I was losing my grip on reality, but what could I do? Who would believe me if I told them I was being haunted by the ghost of a man whose life insurance application I had denied? As weeks passed, I grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. The boundaries between waking and sleeping, reality and nightmare, became increasingly blurred. I would find myself in strange places with no memory of how I got there, standing on the roof of my apartment building, or in the middle of a graveyard across town. And always, I felt those pale blue eyes watching me. I knew I couldn't go on like this. Something had to give. In desperation, I decided to confront the source of my torment. I would go to Ezekiel Thorne's grave and what? Apologize. Beg for forgiveness. I didn't know, but I had to do something. The cemetery was eerily quiet as I made my way through the rows of headstones. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me. Finally, I found it. A simple granite headstone with the name Ezekiel Thorne carved into it. Below, the dates of his birth and death. And at the bottom, a single line: his claim was denied, but his spirit endures. I stood there, staring at those words as darkness fell around me. What was I doing here? What did I hope to accomplish? "I'm sorry," I whispered, feeling foolish but desperate. "I'm sorry I denied your application. I was just doing my job. Please leave me alone." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of nearby trees. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper on the breeze. Too late, Mr. Insurance Man. Far too late. I turned to leave, my heart heavy with the realization that this had all been for nothing. But as I took a step away from the grave, the ground beneath my feet suddenly gave way. I fell, tumbling into darkness. The smell of damp earth filled my nostrils as I landed hard on something solid. As I lay there, winded and disoriented, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The scrape of wood on wood, like a coffin lid being slowly opened. A bony hand emerged from the darkness, gripping my ankle. As I was dragged deeper into the earth, the last thing I saw was a pair of pale blue eyes, gleaming with triumph. Welcome, Ezekiel's raspy voice echoed around me, to your eternal policy, Mr. Insurance Man. I'm afraid the premiums are quite steep, but don't worry, we have all of eternity to settle the account. The darkness closed in, and I knew that my claim on life had finally been denied. I jolted awake, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The familiar surroundings of my bedroom slowly came into focus, bathed in the soft glow of early morning light. I was drenched in sweat. The sheets tangled around my legs like a burial shroud. For a moment, relief washed over me. It had all been a dream, a horrific, vivid nightmare, but a dream nonetheless. I let out an exhausted laugh, running my hands through my hair. I stumbled out of bed, my legs weak and unsteady. The world seemed to tilt and swim around me as I made my way to the bathroom. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the lingering tendrils of the nightmare. But when I looked up into the mirror, my blood ran cold. There, reflected in the glass behind me, were a pair of pale blue eyes. I whirled around, my heart in my throat, but the bathroom was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the eyes were gone once again. I called in sick to work that day, unable to face the thought of dealing with more insurance claims. Instead, I spent hours researching hauntings, exorcisms, anything that might help me understand what was happening. But the more I read, the more hopeless I felt. How could I fight something that shouldn't even exist? As night fell, I found myself dreading sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ezekiel's withered face, those pale blue eyes boring into my soul. I tried everything to stay awake, coffee, energy drinks, even slapping myself across the face. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off into an uneasy slumber. The dream started as it always did. I was back in the Everlast office, Ezekiel's file open on my desk. But this time, as I reached for the denied stamp, I hesitated. What if I approved it? Would that end this nightmare? With a trembling hand, I picked up the approved stamp instead. As it came down on the paper, I felt a rush of relief. Maybe now it would be over. But as I looked up, Ezekiel was there, his decaying face inches from mine. Too late, Mr. Insurance Man, he rasped. Your policy has already been cashed in. I woke up screaming, thrashing against the sheets. As I fought to catch my breath, I realized something was different. The room smelled wrong, like formaldehyde and decay. Slowly, I turned my head towards the bedroom door. It was open, and standing in the doorway was a figure I had hoped never to see in the waking world. Ezekiel Thorne shuffled into the room, his movements stiff and unnatural. In the dim light, I could see the waxy sheen of his skin, the sunken hollows of his cheeks. But it was his eyes that held me paralyzed. Those pale blue orbs, now cloudy with death but still piercing in their intensity. Did you really think it would be that easy? He wheezed, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. That you could simply stamp approved and wash your hands of me? I tried to speak, to plead, to reason with him, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't respond, pinned to the bed by an unseen force. Ezekiel reached the side of the bed, looming over me. You denied me in life, Mr. Insurance Man, but death is a far more lenient underwriter. And now, it's time to collect on your policy. He reached out a bony hand, his finger pointing directly at my forehead. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever was to come. But the touch never came. Instead, I heard a sound that didn't belong, the shrill ring of a telephone. My eyes snapped open. I was alone in my bedroom, sunlight streaming through the windows. The phone on my nightstand continued to ring insistently. With a shaking hand, I picked it up. Hello? Mr. Johnson? It was my boss's voice. Where are you? You were supposed to be here an hour ago for the meeting with the new clients. I glanced at the clock and cursed. I had overslept. I'm sorry. I'll be right there, I stammered, already scrambling out of bed. As I rushed to get ready, my mind was reeling. Had it all been a dream? But the bruise on my forehead was still there, faded but visible. I made it to the office in record time, sliding into the conference room just as the meeting was starting. As I took my seat, trying to catch my breath, I froze. Sitting across the table, his pale blue eyes locked on mine, was Ezekiel Thorne. He looked different in the harsh fluorescent light of the office. Less corpse-like, more human, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Mr. Johnson, my boss said, I'd like you to meet our new client. Mr. Thorne. He's interested in a rather unique life insurance policy. Ezekiel's lips curled into a small smile. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Insurance Man, he said, his voice dry but devoid of the otherworldly rasp I had come to associate with him. I have a feeling we're going to be working very closely together. As he reached across the table to shake my hand, I saw the glint of triumph in those pale blue eyes. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was only the beginning. The meeting passed in a blur. I nodded and smiled automatically, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. How could Ezekiel be here, alive and well, when I had seen his obituary, when he had haunted my dreams and invaded my waking hours as a decaying corpse? As the other attendees filed out of the room, Ezekiel lingered. He approached me slowly, his movements fluid and natural, nothing like the stiff, shuffling gait of the creature that had haunted me. Quite a shock, isn't it, Mr. Johnson? He said softly, those pale blue eyes never leaving mine. To see the dead walk among the living? I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I don't understand, I managed to croak out. You were. I saw. Ezekiel's smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a shade too white, too perfect. Death is not always as final as people believe, he said, especially for those of us who have certain connections. He leaned in closer, and I caught a whiff of that familiar formaldehyde scent. You denied my claim once, Mr. Insurance Man, but now, I'm offering you a policy of your own, one that will guarantee your safety and sanity. What? What do you want? I whispered, unable to look away from those hypnotic blue eyes. It's simple. Really? Ezekiel replied. You'll be my personal insurance agent from now on. Every policy I bring to you, you'll approve, no questions asked. In return, I'll ensure that your nights are peaceful and your days, well, let's just say you won't have to worry about any unexpected visits. I knew I should refuse. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, but the memory of those endless nightmares, the constant fear and paranoia, was too fresh. Do we have a deal, Mr. Insurance Man? Ezekiel extended his hand, his pale blue eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. With a sense of finality, I reached out and shook his hand. His skin was cold and dry, like old parchment. Excellent, Ezekiel said, his smile growing impossibly wide. I look forward to a long and profitable relationship. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Johnson, sweet dreams. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without nightmares. But as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just signed away something far more valuable than any insurance policy. And in the shadows of my room, I could have sworn I saw a pair of pale blue eyes watching, waiting, as I descended into a dreamless sleep. The weeks that followed were a blur of surreal normalcy. By day, I went through the motions at work, approving every policy that crossed my desk with Ezekiel's name attached. They were always for astronomical sums, always for clients with medical histories that should have disqualified them immediately. But I stamped each one approved without hesitation, the memory of those nightmarish weeks still fresh in my mind. By night, I slept peacefully, undisturbed by visions of decay and whispers of eternity. But the price of this tranquility weighed heavily on my conscience. As the months wore on, I began to notice changes in myself. My reflection in the mirror looked older, somehow. Gaunt. There were streaks of gray in my hair that hadn't been there before. It was as if Ezekiel was slowly draining the life from me, one approved policy at a time. It was nearly a year to the day since I'd made my deal when Ezekiel called me into his office. Yes, he had an office now, a corner suite with a view of the city. As I entered, I noticed the smell of formaldehyde was stronger than ever. "Ah, Mr. Johnson," he said, those pale blue eyes gleaming. "I have a special policy for you today, one I think you'll find particularly interesting." He slid a folder across the desk. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a life insurance application. My life insurance application. As the meaning of his words sank in, I felt a chill run down my spine. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading all along. Ezekiel had never intended to let me go. He was going to claim me, just as he'd claimed all those other poor souls whose policies I'd approved. But in that moment of terror, something inside me snapped. I'd spent my whole career assessing risks, calculating odds, and suddenly, I realized Ezekiel's power over me was built on fear. Fear that I'd given him willingly. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. Ezekiel's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon?" I stood up, looking him directly in those pale blue eyes. I said no. This wasn't part of our deal. And I'm done being afraid of you. For a moment, Ezekiel's facade slipped, revealing the decaying horror beneath. But I held my ground. "You have no power over me," I continued, my confidence growing. "You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on fear and bureaucracy. Well, I'm cutting you off." I grabbed the file with my application and tore it in half. As the pieces fell to the floor, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. Ezekiel let out an inhuman shriek, lunging across the desk at me, but his movements were slow, clumsy, as if he was struggling to maintain his form in our world. I dodged his grasping hands and ran for the door. As I threw it open, I shouted to the stunned office beyond, "Everyone, listen. Don't approve any more of his policies. He has no power if we don't give it to him." Chaos erupted in the office. Some people screamed. Others looked confused. But I saw understanding dawn in a few faces. Those who, like me, had been haunted by nightmares of pale blue eyes and the smell of formaldehyde. As I ran through the building, shouting my warning, I heard Ezekiel's enraged howls behind me. But with each person who listened, each policy that was questioned instead of blindly approved, his voice grew fainter. I burst out of the building into the sunlight, gasping for breath. For a moment, I thought I saw Ezekiel's withered face in the reflection of a nearby window, those pale blue eyes filled with impotent rage. But then it was gone, fading like a bad dream in the morning light. In the days that followed, there was an investigation. Hundreds of fraudulent policies were uncovered, all traced back to the mysterious Ezekiel Thorne, who seemed to have vanished into thin air. The company underwent a major overhaul, with a new emphasis on ethical practices and thorough vetting. As for me, I slept peacefully for the first time in what felt like years. The nightmares were gone, banished along with the specter of Ezekiel Thorne. I'd learned a valuable lesson about the power of facing your fears and the importance of reading the fine print. Sometimes, on dark nights, I think I catch a whiff of formaldehyde or see a flash of pale blue eyes in the shadows. But I'm not afraid anymore. After all, I know the truth now. No ghost, no matter how malevolent or cunning, can stand against the power of human will and a properly denied insurance claim. I'm not exactly sure where to turn with this. Paranormal forums have been no help, and most places on the internet just start talking about salt, iron, and calling Sam and Dean to fix the issue. This is real though, and it's getting worse, and I'm fucking terrified. About a week ago, I came home late from work at my usual time. I usually get off around 10:30, and my roommate Jackson works pretty early, so it's not uncommon to see him passed out on the couch. That night though, he was wide awake, sitting and watching a scary movie with the lights off. I greeted him and tossed my keys on the table, but as I went to reach for the light, he turned and yelled at me, "Leave it off." I jumped back, startled. "What the fuck, man?" "Sorry." He settled back on the couch, his eyes turning towards the screen again. "We're just trying to enjoy the atmosphere of the movie." I looked around and didn't see anyone else in the room. Tension filled the air. "Who's we? You got a mouse in your pocket," I joked, hoping to lighten things and make it feel normal again. Instead, he turned to me with wide, glassy eyes and corrected himself. I'm trying to enjoy the atmosphere of the movie. He slowly turned his head back towards the screen where some masked killer was stalking his victim. A combination of the intensity in his eyes, the dark room, the scary movie, and the way he'd reacted to my arrival sent a shiver up my spine and put a sick feeling in my stomach. Whatever, man. I tried to shake it off. See you in the morning. I walked away towards my room, but he didn't respond. His eyes glued on the screen as he silently watched the movie with a stiff-backed posture. I turned back to him one last time before I shut my door, and I could swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye standing next to the couch. I did a double take and it was gone. Instead, I noticed Jackson had turned his head toward me. His eyes were still glassy, and his mouth stretched itself into a toothy smile. I quickly shut my bedroom door and locked it. I flicked on my TV and put on some random YouTube videos to hopefully distract me from what I just saw. Was he fucking with me? Trying to scare me? What the hell had just happened? Jackson had always been a bit of a prankster. One time he hid the vacuum in my room and set it up to an electrical switch on a timer. Damn thing went off at 3 in the morning and scared the shit out of me. That was funny though. This was not. I spent the rest of the night laying in bed and staring at my TV with his bizarre smile imprinted on my brain. I thought about getting up and confronting him, but before I knew it, I heard the TV shut off in the living room and him go to his room and close the door. Any expectation I had of him coming to my door, knocking, apologizing and explaining what the hell just happened died. Instead, I decided to try and get some sleep and ask him in the morning. Sure, it was weird, and yes, it creeped me out. But at the time, I didn't realize I was living in what would become a nightmare. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt and shrugged it off. I can hear you wondering why I didn't just book it right then and there. But the guy had been my roommate for 3 years with barely any issues. He was a nice dude with no history of anything weird as far as I knew, and it was much easier to assume it was a strange night, and my eyes and brain were playing tricks on me after a long night of work. I convinced myself it was a badly timed joke on his part, and in time I fell asleep. The next morning I woke to find Jackson sitting at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cereal and scrolling on his phone. I could smell coffee brewing in the pot. "Morning, dude," he said in his typical cheerful tone, not looking up from his breakfast. "Made coffee. Help yourself." "Morning." I side-eyed him as I walked through the kitchen, and finally he caught my gaze. "What?" He shot me a confused look and shrugged his shoulders as he spooned some more cereal into his mouth. "Last night, dude. Not funny." I couldn't believe he was playing stupid with me. "You actually freaked me the hell out." He laughed and shook his head. "Sorry, man. I was just fucking with you. I guess the horror movie put me in a mood." I actually remember breathing a sigh of relief. I had figured he was messing with me, but hearing it confirmed made me feel a lot better. "I don't mind a prank now and then, man. Just save it for when I'm not exhausted." I poured myself some coffee and started heading back towards my room to try and relax during my day off. "You got it, brother." He raised his bowl to me in a cheers and smiled a normal smile, but as I walked away, I heard his tone change and lower to be almost imperceptible. He spoke words that once again filled my gut with ice. "We'll try to be more considerate next time." "What did you just say?" I turned to him again. "Me," he said with a mouthful of cereal. "Nothing." "You definitely said something," I insisted. "Dude, you are being weird as hell." He got up and put his now empty bowl in the sink. "Listen, I'm sorry I messed with you last night. I promise I didn't say shit though." Again, I know what I heard, but he was convincing as hell. It was easy to trick myself into thinking I was psyching myself out. There was no reason the guy would be gaslighting me. At worst, he was just messing with me, and if I told myself I just needed to let it go, everything would go back to normal. "I guess I'm still just tired and a little tweaked out from last night," I said to him. I sipped my coffee and headed towards my room again. "Sorry, man." "No worries," he said, heading towards his room as well. "Sorry I tweaked you with my joke." I thought that would be that. But 2 nights later, things got way worse. I woke up at about 1:30 to the sound of scratching at my door. It was like a dog begging to be let in, despite the fact that neither Jackson or I have a dog. I wiped the sleep from my eyes and stared at the door with an intense focus. The sound continued. Small scratches. Short and quick. It made me think a bit of scurrying rats gnawing on support beams in the walls. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could and got closer to the door. I pressed my ear to the wood and could feel vibrations of whatever was scratching on the other side. "Jackson," I called out, unsure if I was expecting a response. "What's up, man?" I heard him right away, but not next to my door. He sounded like he was in the living room. I flung the door open to nothing. Moonlight crept in through the window and cast an eerie blue over the apartment. But Jackson wasn't there. No rat. No dog. No roommate. Nothing to have made the noise, and no one to have called back to me. Maybe I should have been scared, but honestly, I was irritated. He was still trying to mess with me, and I just wasn't in the mood. I walked across the hall to his door and knocked on it aggressively. "Jack." I almost shouted, but thought better. I kept my tone firm and knocked again. "Jack." "What the fuck?" "Man." Silence. I pressed my ear against his door. "Jack," I said again in a softer tone. He didn't respond. I tried his knob and his door wasn't locked. As I turned the handle, this creeping dread filled me that something awful was waiting for me on the other side of that door. "Hey man, are you all right in there?" I slowly pushed the door open, and as the room slowly came into view, I saw Jackson sitting on his bed with his back to me. His posture was stiff like before while he was watching the movie, hands on his knees, his body still as a statue. "Dude, what the hell is?" My words caught in my throat as the rest of the room came into view. I still can't fully believe what I saw standing there. A figure stood next to Jack. Tall. I would guess almost 7 feet. A sheet was draped over it like an old ghost costume, but without the eye holes. Just a white sheet with what looked to be a person underneath. "I'm fine," Jackson spoke, but not alone. The thing underneath the sheet spoke with him in unison, its gravelly, rotten voice tangled with his. "I'm just hanging out with my new friend." I almost screamed, but I was so goddamn scared that at that moment I was frouncing in place. Something about this made me realize this was no joke. The thing under the sheet gave off the worst air of danger I'd ever felt in my life, like staring down the barrel of a gun. "He came knocking the other night." They both spoke. The thing just a half second before Jack, though, like it was guiding his voice. "I let him in. He likes it here. So warm and inviting." I backed away. Slowly. A terror filled me and told me to flee. I felt like if I ran it would chase me, like locking eyes with a predator in the wild. "We can all be friends now. The best of friends. Jackson says you're easy to scare." It was speaking alone now. "Show me." With that it moved across the room, and then it was directly in front of me. It didn't walk or run. It was like it fucking fast-forwarded. Startled. I stumbled backwards and into the wall behind me, cracking my head on a framed picture. I scrambled to my feet and looked up. Jackson was once again wearing that stiff smile and standing next to this thing, this intruder. "Seaman Day, brother," they said together. "Let's all watch something scary." The sheet lifted ever so slightly, and a gaunt gray arm slid from underneath. Thin, bony fingers reached for me and snagged the collar of my shirt as I attempted to bolt down the hall and to the front door. I heard the fabric rip as I tore myself free and sprinted to the exit. "We can all live here together. No need to run." The voice got muddier. "Ugly." It sounded like it was underwater and distorted shredded vocal cords. I flung open the front door and flew into the hallway. The hall lights burned my eyes for a second as I ran to the stairs. All around me, at every apartment door I heard knocking as I tore my way down the hallway. I saw some people opening their doors to find out what was going on. Each of them went blank as soon as they did. I watched some of them fling the door open, ready to scream at whoever was knocking so late. But their expression dropped, and their eyes went as glassy as Jack's. I jumped down, skipping 3 to 4 steps at a time, my bare feet slapping against the cold vinyl floors of the building's hallways. More and more doors opened, people standing frouncing at the threshold, and those tall sheet-covered entities standing next to them. Some were guiding them back into their homes. Some just watched me as I moved as quickly as I could down the hall. I burst out through the front door into the warm night air. I must have ran 3 or 4 blocks before the realization hit me that I was in my pajama pants. No phone, No wallet, no keys, no shoes, and no fucking idea what to do. I ended up finding an all-night diner that let me use their phone. I thought about calling the cops, but what do I say? Ghosts have taken over my apartment building and the residents are hypnotized, possessed. Nothing I could say wouldn't sound insane. I would get treated like a fucking crackpot. I called my sister. I wasn't even sure what to say to her. I told her something was wrong with Jackson. He was acting crazy, and I was not comfortable staying in the apartment anymore. I've been here for 3 days now. I don't know what to do anymore. At the urging of my sister, I called the police to at least do a wellness check on Jackson. I was terrified of sending anyone to that apartment building, but they told us they checked on him, and everything seemed fine. He answered all their questions normally. Told them he had pulled a bad joke on me and he was okay. This was not a joke, and I feel like I'm going crazy. My sister Ashley and her husband are urging me to just go home and talk it out with him, or at least get my things. I don't know what to do though. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I was no stranger to the glitz and grime of Hollywood. At 45, I'd seen it all, from drug overdoses to high-profile murders. Specializing in celebrity crimes, I'd built a reputation as the go-to detective when the rich and famous found themselves in serious trouble. Arrogant, maybe, but I often found myself critiquing the very arrogance I saw in the stars I investigated. It was a job for me, and the glittering facade of fame held no allure. It was a crisp morning in 1999 when I received the call that would plunge me into one of the most bizarre cases of my career. The phone rang shrilly on my desk, piercing the quiet hum of the precinct. I picked it up, expecting another overdosed starlet or a drunken brawl between A-listers. Instead, the voice on the other end spoke of a death in the notorious mansion of Rachel Matheston, a young actress whose meteoric rise had captivated Hollywood. Rachel Matheston, 23, married to an older man, had been found dead under mysterious circumstances. My interest was piqued. I remembered the mansion well. It had once belonged to pop sensation Emily Willis, who had famously gone crazy shortly after moving in. The press had had a field day with Emily's public meltdowns and eventual departure from the house. And now, it seemed, the mansion had claimed another victim. I hung up the phone, a mix of skepticism and curiosity swirling in my mind. I grabbed my coat and headed out, the weight of another high-profile case settling on my shoulders. As I drove through the winding roads of the Hollywood Hills, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this case than met the eye. The mansion loomed ahead, a sprawling estate with an unsettling aura. The scene was a familiar chaos of flashing cameras, reporters, and yellow police tape. I parked my car and made my way through the crowd, flashing my badge to gain entry. The paparazzi buzzed around like vultures, hungry for any scrap of information. Inside, the opulence of the mansion was overshadowed by the somber scene. Rachel's lifeless body lay at the foot of the grand staircase, her once vibrant presence now a ghostly shell. I took in the details, the lavish decor, the eerie silence, the faint smell of expensive perfume mingled with death. It was a stark reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in this town. Rachel's older husband, Frank Lester, was a famous producer with a reputation as scummy as they came. Everyone in Hollywood knew his name, and not for the best reasons. As I surveyed the room, I couldn't help but think of Emily Willis. Just a few years ago, Emily had lived here, her career unraveling in a series of bizarre incidents. The mansion had always seemed cursed, a beautiful trap that ensnared its residents. I pushed the thoughts aside. I dealt with facts, not fantasies, and there was a job to do. The initial examination of the scene offered little. Rachel's body showed no obvious signs of trauma, and the cause of death was not immediately apparent. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an overdose? Foul play? Or something more sinister? I knew the answers wouldn't come easily. As I continued my investigation, I couldn't ignore the mansion's dark history. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, and the air was thick with an unspoken dread. I would have to dig deep, uncovering the layers of fame, tragedy, and possibly the supernatural, to get to the truth. Rachel looked almost peaceful, as if she'd simply decided to lie down and never get up again. There were no apparent signs of trauma, no blood, no bruises. It was as if life had just quietly slipped away. The first responders had already cordoned off the area, and I made my way over to the officer in charge. "What have we got?" I asked, keeping my voice low. "Not much, Detective," he replied. "No signs of forced entry. No immediate cause of death. It's a real mystery." I nodded, my mind racing through the possibilities. Overdose seemed likely, given Hollywood's penchant for excess. But something about the scene felt off. The mansion's history loomed large in my mind. Emily Willis, the pop star who had lived here before Rachel, had famously unraveled within these walls. Her public meltdowns and subsequent departure had only added to the mansion's dark reputation. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more here, something beneath the surface. As I looked around the lavishly decorated room, my eyes were drawn to small details: a vase slightly askew, a rug with a corner turned up, little things that hinted at a struggle or at least a hurried exit. Rachel's husband, Frank Lester, was nowhere to be seen, but I knew I'd have to talk to him soon. His reputation as a scummy producer preceded him, and I had no doubt he'd have plenty to say, or not say, about his young wife's untimely death. First, though, I needed to gather some initial statements. I approached one of the first responders, a young officer who looked a bit green around the gills. "What did you find when you got here?" I asked. "Not much, sir," he replied, his voice shaky. "The body was already cold. No signs of struggle that we could see. It was like she just stopped." I nodded, filing away his words. I needed more than that, something concrete to go on. As I moved through the house, I spoke with the staff who had been present. A maid, her face pale and drawn, told me she had found Rachel that morning. "She was just lying there," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I didn't know what to do. Her fear was palpable, making me wonder what else she might know. But for now, I had to keep moving. There were more pieces to this puzzle, and I needed to find them. As I examined the room, my eyes caught on a small, almost imperceptible detail: a smudge on the wall near the staircase. It was faint, barely there, but it looked like a handprint. A chill ran down my spine as I realized it was too high to be Rachel's. I stepped back, my mind working overtime. There was more to this than met the eye, and I was determined to uncover it. The mansion held its secrets close, but I was ready to dig deep, to peel back the layers of fame and tragedy that cloaked this place. Rachel Matheson's rise to fame had been nothing short of meteoric. From her first breakout role at 17, she captured the hearts of millions with her raw talent and striking beauty. By 23, she was a household name, gracing the covers of magazines and starring in blockbuster films. She had the kind of career most actresses could only dream of, and her public image was carefully curated to perfection. Then came Frank Lester, a renowned producer with a reputation that was as much a liability as an asset. Frank was known for his questionable ethics and a string of scandals that never quite seemed to stick. When Rachel announced their marriage, the public was shocked. She was young, vibrant, and seemingly on top of the world, while Frank was older and notoriously scummy. The media speculated endlessly about their relationship, but Rachel remained tight-lipped, always the picture of grace under pressure. Their marriage, however, was anything but perfect. According to friends, Rachel's life began to change after she moved into the mansion with Frank. The house was beautiful, perched high in the Hollywood Hills, but it had a history that seemed to cast a long shadow over its inhabitants. Before moving into the mansion, Rachel was a regular on the party circuit, always seen with a smile on her face and a drink in her hand. But soon after settling into her new home, her behavior started to shift. She withdrew from the public eye, her once frequent appearances dwindling to almost nothing. Rumors began to circulate that Rachel had become a recluse, trapped within the gilded cage of her mansion. I started digging deeper, talking to those who had known her best. Calling her friends and colleagues painted a picture of a young woman who had been full of life and ambition, only to be slowly consumed by something she couldn't understand. They spoke of strained relationships, particularly with Frank. The glitz and glamour of their marriage had quickly worn off, revealing a much darker reality. She wasn't herself, one friend told me. Rachel was always so vibrant, so full of energy, but after she moved in with Frank, it was like a light had gone out inside her. Others mentioned more disturbing details. Rachel had confided in a few close friends that she felt like she was being watched. Even when she was alone, she spoke of strange noises at night, whispers, footsteps, the feeling of being touched by unseen hands. At first, her friends thought she was just stressed, or maybe even dabbling in substances to cope with the pressures of her career and marriage. But as her stories grew more consistent, so did their concern. Over the phone, I would go on to interview a former assistant who had worked with Rachel up until a few months before her death. She described Rachel's increasing paranoia and erratic behavior. She'd call me in the middle of the night, terrified, the assistant said. She'd say there was someone in the house, but when we checked, there was no one there. It got to the point where I was scared to go over, but I couldn't leave her like that. The more I learned, the more it seemed that Rachel's decline was not just a result of personal troubles, but something more sinister. Her friends hinted at foul play, though none could provide concrete evidence. There were whispers that Frank had been controlling, possibly even abusive, though no one dared to say it outright. It was becoming clear that Rachel's death was surrounded by a web of secrets and lies. Her complaints about feeling watched and experiencing strange events in the mansion couldn't be easily dismissed. There was something deeply wrong in that house, and it had taken its toll on both Rachel and her predecessor, Emily Willis. As I gathered these fragments of Rachel's life, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of urgency. The mansion was more than just a backdrop to her tragedy. It was a vital piece of the puzzle. I needed to find out what had truly happened to Rachel Matheston, and why the mansion seemed to claim everyone who lived there. My first stop was Frank Lester, Rachel's husband. He was sitting in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring blankly at a painting on the wall. The room was dark, the only light coming from a small lamp on the desk. It cast long shadows that danced across the walls, giving the space an eerie, almost haunted feel. "Mr. Lester," I said, stepping into the room. "I'm Detective Tyler. I need to ask you a few questions." He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Of course, Detective," he replied, flat and emotionless. "Anything to help." I took a seat opposite him, pulling out my notepad. "Can you tell me about the night Rachel died?" Frank sighed heavily, taking a long sip of his drink. "We had dinner together," he began. "She seemed distant, but that wasn't unusual lately. After dinner, she said she was tired and went to bed early. I stayed up, working in my office. When I checked on her later, she was already gone." I studied his face, looking for any signs of deceit. He was composed, but something about his demeanor didn't sit right with me. "Can anyone confirm your whereabouts during that time?" He shook his head. "No, I was alone." I nodded, jotting down his response. "Did Rachel have any enemies? Anyone who might have wanted to harm her?" Frank's face hardened. Rachel was loved by everyone. She had no enemies. I thanked him and left the study, the weight of his words lingering in my mind. I needed to speak with the staff next. The maid who had found Rachel's body was still visibly shaken. She recounted her discovery in a quivering voice, describing how she had found Rachel lying at the foot of the stairs, her body cold and lifeless. The gardener and security personnel had little to add. Their statements were routine and unremarkable. It was clear that Rachel's death had shocked everyone, but no one seemed to have any concrete answers. Back in the main hall, I began to gather evidence. I meticulously examined every inch of the scene, collecting physical evidence and noting anything out of place. I reviewed the mansion's security footage, but it yielded nothing unusual. Phone records and Rachel's personal items were similarly uninformative, offering no clear leads. As I explored the mansion, the sense of unease grew. The house was vast, with countless rooms and corridors that seemed to stretch forever. Each step I took echoed through the halls, amplifying the silence that hung heavy in the air. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I noticed something odd. A section of the wall didn't quite match the rest of the room. It looked like an ordinary part of the wall, but I realized it was slightly ajar upon closer inspection. Pushing it open, I discovered a hidden door that blended seamlessly with the surrounding wall when closed. Behind the door was a small, hidden room. Dust covered the furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I found old photographs of a young girl and a man on a dusty table. The girl looked eerily familiar, It was Martha Franklin, the famous child actor who had gone missing years ago. The man, her father Ronald, had committed suicide shortly after her disappearance. The room sent a chill down my spine. It was a grim reminder of the mansion's dark past, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to Rachel's death. As the day turned into night, I knew I needed rest to process everything I had found. I headed home, my mind racing with the day's discoveries. As I lay in bed, my thoughts kept returning to the mansion and the secrets it held. Exhaustion eventually pulled me into a restless sleep. That night, the dreams began. They started innocently enough, showing Rachel and Emily Willis's rise to fame. But soon, they turned darker. I saw Rachel's joy and excitement slowly give way to fear and paranoia after moving into the mansion. Emily's dreams were similar, showing her descent into madness, her public meltdowns, and her eventual departure from the house. These dreams felt more like memories than figments of my imagination. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the line between reality and the paranormal blurring more with each passing day. The more I uncovered, the more I was convinced that the mansion itself held the key to understanding Rachel's death. The history of the house, the mysterious disappearances, the eerie experiences, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I needed to solve. Returning to the mansion the next day, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The strange dreams had left a lingering unease, but they had also given me a glimpse into the lives of Rachel and Emily Willis. I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how bizarre or frightening it might be. The mansion greeted me with its usual eerie silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched as I stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to move independently. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that I dealt with facts, not fantasies, but the line between the two was growing increasingly thin. I began my investigation in the main hall, where Rachel's body had been found. I immediately felt a chill sweep through the room, settling over me like a cold blanket. It was an unusually warm day, but the temperature inside the mansion felt like it had dropped several degrees. As I moved through the house, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from one of the rooms upstairs. I rushed towards the sound, my heart pounding. When I arrived, the room was empty, but a vase that had been sitting on a shelf was now shattered on the floor. There was no one else in the house, at least, no one I could see. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I realized I was not alone. As the day wore on, the strange occurrences continued. Objects moved on their own. Cold spots appeared and disappeared without warning, and the whispers grew louder. At one point, I felt a sharp pain in my arm, as if something had scratched me. I looked down to see 3 thin red lines forming, though there was nothing nearby that could have caused them. The physical sensations were unnerving, but the visions were worse. They came suddenly, vivid and disorienting, pulling me into scenes from Rachel and Emily's lives. I saw Rachel pacing her bedroom, her eyes wide with fear. She was muttering to herself, glancing nervously at the door. The next moment, I was in Emily's shoes, standing on the balcony as she screamed at the paparazzi below, her face twisted in anguish. These visions were more than dreams. They were memories imprinted on the very walls of the mansion. Determined to find answers, I revisited the hidden room I had discovered the previous day. The room seemed even more foreboding in the daylight, dust motes dancing in the beams of light that filtered through the small window. I searched through the old photographs and personal items, looking for anything that might explain the hauntings. In a dusty corner, I found a small chest. Inside were Martha Franklin's diary and a bundle of letters. The diary's pages were brittle with age, but the words were still legible. Martha's entries painted a picture of a young girl trapped in a nightmare. Diary entry: August 12, 1978. Father gave me those pills again tonight. He said they would help me sleep, but they make me feel so strange. Everything becomes hazy, and I can barely keep my eyes open. I hate it. I hate how he looks at me when I'm like that. Last night, he had those men over again. They smelled like cigarettes and alcohol. Father told me to be nice to them, that it was for my career. One of them touched my face and smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to pull away, but Father grabbed my arm and whispered, "Do it for the family, Martha." But I feel so dirty and used. I just want it to stop. The horror in her words was palpable, and it made my stomach turn. I could hardly imagine the torment she had endured. The letters from her father were no less disturbing. Letter from Ronald Franklin, November 3, 1979. Martha. Sometimes I look at you and I see nothing but a burden. You were supposed to be my ticket to a better life, but all you bring is misery. Your whining, your refusal to do what needs to be done, it's infuriating. There are days when I wish you had never been born, or better yet, that you would just disappear. You think you're special because you can cry on command and look pretty for the cameras? You're nothing without me. Remember that. The venom in his words was chilling, and it was clear that Ronald Franklin had been a deeply disturbed man. The more I read, the more I understood the depth of the trauma that had seeped into the walls of the mansion. As I pieced together the history of Martha and her father, the unexplained events in the house began to make more sense. The cold spots, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, they were all manifestations of the lingering spirits trapped within the mansion. Martha's pain and her father's cruelty had left an indelible mark, creating a dark energy that affected everyone who lived there. The experiences weren't just confined to the hidden room. As I moved through the house, I could feel the weight of their presence everywhere. In the kitchen, utensils clattered in drawers, seemingly of their own accord. In the living room, books fell from shelves, their pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of unrest. That night, as I lay in bed, the dreams came again. They were more intense than before, pulling me deeper into the lives of Rachel and Emily. I saw Rachel arguing with Frank, her face contorted with fear and anger. She pleaded with him, begging him to believe her about what she was experiencing. Frank dismissed her, calling her hysterical and accusing her of making it all up for attention. In another dream, I saw Emily scribbling frantically in a journal, her hands shaking. She wrote about the voices she heard at night, the shadows that seemed to move on their own. She described waking up with bruises and scratches, just like I had. Her terror was palpable, and I could feel it seeping into my own subconscious. The line between reality and dreams was almost non-existent when I awoke. I knew I needed to speak with someone who had experienced this firsthand. I contacted Emily Willis, hoping she could provide insight into her time in the mansion. Finding her wasn't difficult. She had retreated from the public eye, but still lived in Los Angeles. When I called, Emily was initially hesitant, but mentioning the mansion and Rachel's death seemed to break through her reluctance. She agreed to meet me at a small, secluded cafe the following day. Emily looked different from her days of stardom. There was a fragility about her, a wariness in her eyes. Over coffee, she shared her story. "The house changes you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like it has a mind of its own. I started hearing things and seeing things. It made me doubt my sanity." She described the same sensations I had experienced, the cold spots, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. She spoke of nightmares that mirrored the visions I'd had. "It wasn't just me," she continued. "I think the house amplifies whatever darkness is inside you. It feeds on it." Emily's story confirmed my suspicions. The mansion was more than just a building. It was a vessel for the tormented spirits of Martha and her father. The trauma and violence of their lives had seeped into the very fabric of the house, affecting everyone who lived there. As our conversation drew to a close, Emily looked at me with a mix of pity and resolve. "If you want to help Rachel, you need to set Martha free. She's the key to all of this." Her words echoed in my mind as I left the cafe. The path ahead was becoming clearer, but it was also more dangerous. I was dealing with forces beyond my understanding, but I was determined to see it through. Rachel's death couldn't be in vain, and the spirits of the mansion deserved peace. Preparing for what lay ahead, I knew this was not going to be a conventional confrontation. This wasn't about suspects and alibis, but restless spirits and unresolved trauma. I needed to free Martha and banish her father's dark presence once and for all. The tools at my disposal were not weapons or handcuffs, but the truth found in Martha's diary and Ronald's letters. I gathered everything I needed: Martha's diary, Ronald's letters, and some personal artifacts I had found in the hidden room. These items held the essence of their lives and, I hoped, the power to bring closure to their spirits. I decided to return to the mansion at night, when the paranormal activity seemed to be at its peak. As I arrived, the mansion was shrouded in darkness, its imposing silhouette framed against the night sky. The atmosphere was tense and foreboding, the air heavy with anticipation. I could feel the eyes of unseen entities watching me as I made my way inside. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind seemed amplified in the silence. I headed straight for the hidden room, the epicenter of the mansion's dark energy. Once inside, I arranged Martha's artifacts carefully on the dusty table, creating a shrine of sorts. I placed her diary at the center, flanked by the letters from her father and the old photographs. Taking a deep breath, I began to read aloud from Martha's diary. "Father gave me those pills again tonight. He said they would help me sleep, but they make me feel so strange." As I read, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The air grew colder, and I saw my breath forming misty clouds. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and I felt a palpable presence gathering around me. I continued reading, my voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. "He had those men over again. They smelled like cigarettes and alcohol. Father told me to be nice to them, that it was for my career." A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles I had lit. The darkness was almost complete, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the small window. I could hear faint whispers, indistinct but filled with malice. The temperature plummeted further, and I shivered despite myself. I pulled out one of Ronald's letters and began to read. "Martha, sometimes I look at you, and I see nothing but a burden." The reaction was immediate. The room seemed to shake, and an unseen force threw me back against the wall. Pain shot through my body as I struggled to get up. The whispers grew louder and angrier, and I felt sharp, invisible claws rake across my back. I gritted my teeth and pushed on. "You were supposed to be my ticket to a better life, but all you bring is misery." The shadows coalesced into a darker, more solid form. Ronald's spirit was manifesting, a twisted, malevolent figure that seemed to pulse with anger. His eyes burned with an unnatural light as he moved towards me, his presence suffocating. The air grew thick, and I struggled to breathe. As I continued to read, Martha's spirit began to appear. At first, she was faint, a barely perceptible glow in the darkness, but with each word from her diary, her presence grew stronger. She was a pale, ethereal figure, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. "Last night, he had those men over again. They smelled like cigarettes and alcohol." Ronald's spirit howled in rage, his form growing more turbulent. He lunged at me, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing the life out of me. I gasped for air, my vision blurring, but I couldn't stop now. "Martha," I gasped, struggling to keep my voice steady. "You need to stand up to him. You need to tell him he no longer has power over you." Her form solidified further, her eyes locking onto Ronald's. "Father," she said, her voice trembling but strong, "you have no power over me anymore. You can't hurt me or anyone else ever again." Ronald's spirit recoiled, his form flickering. "You think you can defy me," he snarled, his voice echoing with fury. "You are nothing without me." Martha stepped forward, her presence growing more formidable. "You're wrong," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I am stronger than you ever were. Your hatred and cruelty end here." The room shook violently, and I felt the pressure on my chest release. Ronald's spirit howled in rage, thrashing wildly. I could see his form disintegrating, bits of darkness peeling away like ash in the wind. Martha's light grew brighter, pushing back the shadows. "Stay away, you whore," Ronald roared. But his voice was weaker, his form dissolving. With a final, defiant cry, Martha stepped forward and reached out her hand. "Goodbye, Daddy," she said, her voice ringing with authority. Ronald's spirit let out a final, agonized scream before dissolving completely. The darkness lifted, and the room was filled with an almost blinding light. Martha's spirit turned to me, a look of gratitude and peace on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her form beginning to fade. "You've set me free." As her spirit disappeared, the oppressive atmosphere in the mansion lifted. The air felt lighter, the shadows less menacing. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. The spirits of the mansion had been released, and their torment had finally ended. In the aftermath, I stood in the hidden room, reflecting on what had just transpired. The mansion felt different now. Its dark history confronted and laid to rest. I gathered the artifacts and carefully placed them back in the chest. They were no longer needed to keep the spirits at bay, but would serve as a reminder of the mansion's turbulent past. As I left the mansion, I contemplated its future. The story of Rachel and Emily, of Martha and Ronald, would likely become legend, drawing curiosity and speculation. The mansion itself, now free of its dark influence, might finally be at peace. Back at the precinct, I filed my report, knowing that the official story would never fully capture the actual events. Some things were beyond explanation, existing in the realms of the supernatural and the human heart. The case had tested my beliefs and my resolve, but in the end, it had reaffirmed my commitment to seeking the truth, no matter how strange or unsettling. I focused on the tangible evidence, Martha's diary, Ronald's letters, the hidden room, and left the paranormal experiences implied rather than explicitly stated. Returning home, I felt a wave of exhaustion crash over me. The physical toll of the confrontation and the emotional weight of the case left me drained. I collapsed onto my bed, too tired to change my clothes. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless, filled with fragments of the night's events and the faces of those I had tried to help. I began by recounting the facts: Rachel's death, the investigation, the discovery of the hidden room, and the artifacts I found there. As I wrote, I realized that the truth, however strange, needed to be told. I included excerpts from Martha's diary detailing her father's abuse and the horrors she endured. I added passages from Ronald's letters, exposing his resentment and cruelty. I documented the physical evidence: the scratches, the cold spots, and the whispers. I framed the supernatural elements as psychological phenomena, the result of intense trauma and unresolved conflict. The media frenzy that followed was inevitable. Headlines screamed of haunted mansions and tragic starlets, blending fact with fiction in a way only Hollywood could. The mansion quickly became infamous, and its dark history and recent events made it a prime target for horror stories and ghost tours. The public's morbid curiosity seemed insatiable, and the legend of the mansion grew with each passing day. Amid the chaos, I found moments of quiet reflection. My disbelief in the paranormal had been thoroughly challenged, and I couldn't deny the reality of what I had experienced. The case forced me to confront my own skepticism and consider the possibility that some things were beyond explanation. I often thought of Rachel, Emily, and Martha. Their stories were tragic, each of them a victim of circumstances and forces beyond their control. Rachel's life had been cut short, Emily had been driven to the brink of madness, and Martha had suffered unimaginable horrors at the hands of her father. Their experiences were etched into the fabric of the mansion, their pain and fear lingering long after their deaths. The broader implications of the case weighed heavily on me. It had shown me that the world was far more complex and mysterious than I had ever imagined. As a detective, I was trained to seek the truth, to uncover facts and evidence. But this case had taught me that some truths couldn't be neatly categorized or fully understood. It opened my eyes to reality's darker, more enigmatic aspects. I couldn't help but think about the mansion's future. Part of me hoped it would be left alone, its dark history respected rather than exploited. Another part wished it would be demolished, its haunted walls and twisted legacy reduced to rubble. But I knew the mansion would likely remain a monument to the horrors it had witnessed and the stories it had inspired. Back at the precinct, I discussed the case with my colleagues. Some were intrigued, others skeptical. The details of the confrontation and the release of the spirits were shared in hushed tones, and I could see the impact it had on them. It was a reminder that our work often involved delving into the unknown, confronting not just criminals, but the very nature of reality itself. As I contemplated my next steps, I couldn't shake the feeling that this case had changed me. It had pushed me to the limits of my understanding and forced me to consider the possibility of encountering similar cases in the future. The world was full of mysteries, and I knew that my role as a detective might take me into even darker and stranger territories. For now, though, I was content to reflect on what I had learned, The mansion's dark history had been illuminated, and its restless spirits had been laid to rest. And while the public continued to speculate and sensationalize, I knew the true story, a story of tragedy, resilience, and the enduring power of the truth. The scars across my back were a constant reminder of those three women, and I used them to keep me moving forward.